Hi everyone, my name is Philipp Meissner. Welcome to What's Next. What if school is the problem, not the solution? Joshua Dahn co-founded a school with Elon Musk and is now leading two ventures, rethinking how we learn. In a world racing towards automation and mass reskilling, he is asking the questions that matter. What should we teach? How do we raise better thinkers? And what if everything we thought we knew about education is wrong? Josh, welcome to What's Next.
Thanks for having me.
What was it like building a school with Elon Musk?
It's terrifying. I mean, that was probably the number one thing. It's just very, very frightening to be given what feels like at the time, and it certainly was like an opportunity of a lifetime, and you don't want to squander it. So I would say, in the early days, a lot of it was just open road and not really sure what we were building towards. But by and large, I mean, Elon was incredibly supportive and generous in both his time and also just in his, flexibility, especially in the early days as we were trying to find out what the school was, because we started so small. It was just, basically 15 kids. And it felt more like a homeschool kind of co-op thing than it felt like a proper school. And so as we kind of grew into that, Elon had lots of patience, and there's obviously quite a lot that he could lend in terms of his expertise and thinking about what matters in terms of like what a school should be focused on, and maybe like what matters less, at least in his mind. So that was really helpful in clarifying the kind of paths we should go.
Could you briefly maybe outline the concept of the Ad Astra School that you've built?
Sure. So, the way it started, as I said, is like 15 students in that first year. It was never more than 50 students. About half of the kids had a family member that worked at SpaceX from all levels of the company. So from people whose parents worked as baristas or worked in the kitchen or janitorial, all the way up to the CEO. So it was a really cool concept in that way. And what we tried to do is just to challenge the kids by giving them a taste of the cutting edge. So rather than starting slowly and kind of building fundamentals and then telling you that like one day when you're in graduate school, you could really talk about, this type of topic. We wanted to kind of get them a sense of what's on the front pages of Nature, like now, and how they might be able to think about the implications of the technology and what it will mean. So during that time, I was fortunate enough to hire a bunch of folks who had been hyper educated and had been working at the cutting edge. So one of my colleagues, Dr. Rose, she's her PhD from Caltech. Another of my colleagues, Tara Safronoff, had done some graduate work at Columbia and just like a superlative English instructor. And so I had really talented people that were part of the team early on. And so for me, trying to figure out like how, first of all, when you run a school of 15 kids, there's not a lot of administrative work to do. And the other thing was like, how could I design a class that was not covered in in-depth maths or chemistry or English? And it was this thing called synthesis, which is basically team decision making. So designing case studies for the kids to kind of take on real problems, start thinking about them, making decisions, and then making course corrections based on the feedback they're getting from either the game or the environment or the case study itself. And that's kind of how it started. So it started 15 students, moved up to 50, and then really every day was like an elaborate pageant putting on a school day. So we had a good idea the night before, then it would happen that next day. We were certainly not afraid to try new things and to try to make each day better than one before it.
And what were the main things that were different compared to the traditional school?
Well, I think that the forcing function of thinking things through first principles. So like, what is the purpose of school? Like, what is the purpose of us spending time with these kids in this space and time? And like, what's the efficacy that we're looking for? Like going back to kind of the very basics of all of it, I think for us was a differentiator. Whereas, a lot of schools, you just end up kind of doing similar things. Even if you're a kind of more innovative school, you do end up with some form of math or English or some science or some engineering. And maybe the kids have more autonomy or independence, but ultimately, it doesn't look that different. And I wouldn't say Ad Astra looked so different than a school that you were maybe in or a school that you visited. But I think what did make it different is that everything that we did, we really felt like we had to justify, because if Elon walked through that door, he was like, what is this? I had to be prepared to have an answer. It's like, no, this is like why we're spending time on this thing versus any other thing. So whereas I think most people, or most schools, like if you're just doing something that's maybe a little more conventional, or maybe you don't like really care about it in a deep sense, but you just do it because it just feels normal. If we did that and got caught doing it, we would not be working anymore for Ad Astra School. So I think, not to say that that was what Elon was looking to do, but, I felt like my experience working for Elon was effectively an auditing of my reasoning. So the meetings would just be a rundown of what, the decisions that had been made since we had met last and kind of the direction that things were going. And if it sounded good and the reasoning was sound, then it's like, sounds great, sounds wonderful. Or if there was a moment where I was like, wait, that sounds, well, tell me more about that. And then you would like zoom in and try to understand the thinking. So apply that to a school day. And that's basically what it felt. And so it wasn't so much that Elon was popping in every, third day. It was more so that he was looming large and thinking about, how to spend money thoughtfully, how to conduct a school that merits a place on the campus of SpaceX. Because when you think about in terms of like opportunity cost, that was space at SpaceX that could have been used for an avionics team or a propulsion team or something else. So it felt like this real imperative that we be a worthwhile school. I think that we were, but you always doubt yourself.
And what was your biggest learning from starting the school?
I think that there are things that it's just going to take time, and I think the right amount of like youthful arrogance was probably helpful. And just, even though someone could look at the school and be like, well, this is a school for 15 kids with like 3 teachers, like this is not really a school. We called ourselves a school, we acted like a school, and I think early on we gave ourselves a mission that was pretty different, in that the goal was to have a school that would have an impact on students that were not part of Ad Astra. Because the school is exclusionary just by virtue of its size. It couldn't be much bigger than it was, and having parents worked at SpaceX was certainly helpful in terms of getting into the school. LA is a famously terrible city to commute across. So we had one student who, they had horses. I mean, just give you a sense of how far away they lived. Horses in LA is not a normal thing, and having to commute all the way into SpaceX. So people were driving far distances. So I guess like one thing I learned early on is like, you're not going to have everything online to get going. But if you like kind of believe in where you're going, you can name a mission that's sort of broader than just like the families that you're serving, then there's something you can point to and say like, this is the direction that we're heading. So for us, it was, to what extent does a child who is not at Ad Astra benefit from this school existing? And having that clearly in mind as the ultimate goal allowed us to be really experimental, and then to look for outlets to scale the work, which is pretty unusual for a school, thinking about like designing content that can be like useful other places. So not just experimental, and not an experimental school for experiment's sake, but one in that is looking to add value elsewhere.
And could you give an example of these other outlets that you used?
Yeah, so early on in the forming of that class called Synthesis, I was designing, I would call it like almost like ethical quandaries. But what I really didn't like about my childhood and education was like, we would learn about the rainforest, and we were told basically the stance is the rainforest getting cut down is a horrible atrocity, and the people that are doing it are effectively evil. And of course, there's just more nuance than that. It's not that it's not, deforestation is not largely a good thing, but anyway, there are all these like different shades of gray. And so for me, it was like, well, how, if I was going back to my elementary school experience, like what kind of questions would I want to answer as like a 3rd, 4th, or 5th grader? And so we started writing these questions called Conundrums. And we partnered with a company called Class Dojo, which is the largest educational technology platform in the world. And we just wrote and then had these videos animated and sort of produced them with sound effects and voiceovers and all the rest, and then just released them through Class Dojo. So this has been viewed by millions of students and hundreds of thousands of classrooms around the world, with the idea being that there should be these moments in school where you can disagree constructively with your classmates and with your teacher. And that's a positive thing. So sometimes when you write a question that has these seemingly equivalent options, you really get good discourse back and forth, because people don't necessarily know, even if you feel like you belong to a particular political party, you're not really sure how that maps to this particular question. So you get a lot of, I think, like pure reasoning, and that I love. So anyway, that's an idea of something that happened at Astra. We were kind of experimenting with this idea, then figured out a way to partner with someone that could bring it to scale. Because the goal for Ad Astra was never to be a school that would scale. We're not trying to create a bunch of Ad Astras around the world. And that's still true of Astronova, which is the online derivative of the original in-person school. We're just trying to do experimental work and humbly, share any insights with the world.
Okay, so maybe could you talk a little bit more about your new projects? Astronova, you already mentioned, and Synthesis as well. So what do these companies do, and how do they shape the future of education?
Sure. So we left SpaceX in the summer of 2020. So 6 years on the campus of SpaceX, and Elon's kids graduated. It was just time to move on as a new project. So the school is a nonprofit school. It's called Astronova School. We accept students from around the world, mostly students between the ages of, let's say, like 10 and 14. And it's totally need blind. So any student anywhere in the world can apply. And if they are accepted, then we'll do everything we can to make sure that they can come to the school, even if they paid absolutely nothing at all. And the idea of Astronova is just a place for really creative educators, but not even educators, I guess just people who are working in their fields who believe that if they could go back and do it again, there are things they wish they had known at an earlier age. So they're designing courses for kids that are just really motivated to learn, that are just like eager to be around other kids like them, basically. And we find a lot of kids that, depending on where they live, are quite isolated from other kids maybe like them. And so Astronova is a place for that. So there's about 300 or so students at Astronova. And then each year we create something like 300 unique courses. So for every student, we basically create a unique course. I mean, not that that's a one-on-one, right? But this idea that we're always creating really interesting courses. And then the idea is that there's this menu of courses. So a student, let's say they sign up for 3 blocks for the school year. For those 3 blocks, 3 times a year, they're looking at this menu of options for the classes that are taking place in that block, and they get to choose with their family, which I think is one of like the best conversations you can have, which is like, oh my gosh, I want to take all 7 of these classes. How in the world am I going to just pick one? So we basically, Astronova delights in agonizing choices for just hyper curious kids, and then always just novelty and experimentation to try to find things that are worth sharing. So that's Astronova, the online school. And then the same summer that we left SpaceX, I started a company called Synthesis with Crispin Frank, who's the co-founder and CEO. And the idea there was to bring what the Synthesis class became were these team thinking games, where you were sorted into teams of usually between 3 and 5 students. And then there's a scenario and they're having to make decisions, and other teams are making decisions as well. And you're either in competition or cooperation, it just depends. And the idea being that there are all these interesting insights that we can share with you when you work in all manners of different teams. Because it might be that in a team of 3, like you really do find your voice, but in a team of 5, you're actually quite quiet, even if you're the most experienced player on your team. So the idea of Synthesis originally was to surface some of these collaborative insights that can help students be more effective problem solvers. And then Synthesis, in addition to doing this, which is called Synthesis Teams, there's something called Synthesis Tutor, which is like an AI math tutor, which is a whole separate kind of wild project. But these are kind of the 2 pieces that make up the synthesis of the company of Synthesis. And I do these 2 projects, Astronova and Synthesis, simultaneously.
Wonderful. I mean, you're building the future. If we zoom out for a second and talk about the school system as a whole, why is it actually so broken, and why haven't we been able to fix it so far?
It's really hard. I mean, maybe just the most honest thing I can say is like thinking back to my first teaching experience. So I did a program called Teach for America in Las Vegas, and I taught 5th grade. In my first class, I had 33 students on that first day of school. 5th grade students that truly are not reading at that point. And you've got students that could easily take high school classes, if not, introductory college classes that are ready to run. And those students are all in the same class. There's 33 of them, and there's 1 of me. And at least for me, in my teaching experience, there was a lot of kids coming in and out throughout the school year. So students moving away and then maybe coming back, or moving away and never coming back, or the students moving into the district. So, I ended the year with 33 students, but about 18 of those students had come over the course of the school year. So all to say, as a teacher, it's incredibly difficult to meet the needs of all those students as a single person. It just is. I mean, that's just the truth of it. In terms of like why the system is the way that it is, I mean, I think part of it is that no one really stands by the curriculum as designed and says, like, we think this are the sets of things that are going to give our students like a life of joy and meaning, that like these are the things that are going to make them best prepared to contribute value to all sorts of companies or to start their own one day. Like, I just don't think that anyone is really doing that thinking, or maybe they are, but they're kind of just changing things on the margins. And so what you have is just a lot of inertia. There's a lot just sort of moving in a direction that is not changing the day-to-day experience for most students, I would say, in classrooms over the course of decades. Now, with that being said, I mean, there are incredible bright points, and there are some amazing educators that are doing great work. And I think it's important for people like me who are just fortunate to work kind of in the innovative educational space, you have some real humility about how difficult it is to really to lead a school or to run a classroom, dealing with all the things that you're dealing with that are outside of your control for the most part. So anyway, all to say, I'm hopeful for what will come, but I don't want to underestimate the challenge of, the brokenness is not for lack of for care or effort. It's truly just a problem that's gotten away from us, and I think it might need to be reinvented before it can be fixed.
Agree. And when we look into the future, what would be your vision for how we learn in 5 to 10 years from now?
I think we've sort of started, you've heard this for years now. I think maybe when there was like the flipped classroom model was really popular, it's like, oh, or maybe when Khan Academy first started, it's like, oh my gosh, like if I could learn from like a world-class expert, or my child could, that like no child anywhere in the world would be held back by sort of the quality of teaching available to them, or quality of, I guess, of peers, then that was like a really exciting idea. And I think with sort of where things are going with AI in particular, I do think there's an opportunity that an individual child will not be held back from what they can learn from the school that they go to. So I think part of it is just a reckoning with like what is it that schools do really well, or what they do really well if they were freed from doing some things they don't do as well. How many years of elementary school does it take to teach kids, adding fractions with unlike denominators? Well, I mean, if you look at the curriculum, it's covered in, second, third, fourth, all these different grades. And so I do think some of the learning will go more online, whether those through AI tutors or just like other resources that kids can use. And I think some of the kind of sense making and community building can hopefully then be taken up by the schools. And I think that that's, for me, like a really powerful future, because so there's a deficit in learning, but there's also a deficit in community building. And I think that because we're so focused on, at least in the United States, like the test scores are not moving in the right direction, but we also, are forgetting about just, with COVID and everything else, just like how the importance of human connection and all the rest. So I'm really delighted that the cell phone bans, I think, are really a positive thing for schools, and that's gained some popularity. I think there's a lot more to go in that direction, and I'm hoping that schools are freed from some of the, especially in areas where teachers have been asked to teach things they're actually not very confident in teaching, to free them from some of those things and use their creativity and energy towards more useful ends, which I think of as like friendship building and giving like a taste for discovery and love of challenge and things like that.
So maybe you could double click a little bit on this, because in the world of AI and AI tutors, many people would think that teachers will be unemployed, right? But I think they have a role to play in the future as well. So how do you envision this role?
I think that they're absolutely needed, but I think that we ought to be really honest about what's best for if you start with the kids, like what is actually best for the children? Like, is it to be poorly taught math, or is to be taught math extraordinarily well? And, maybe these things are happening simultaneously because you're still doing the in-person teaching thing, but then outside of school, you're getting, the sort of superlative experience. I think we should re-envision like the role of like what a teacher is, and I think all teachers want their kids to be happier in school, right? Having to have this experience of when there's 33 kids that are looking at you as like the source of authority in a classroom, and you're trying to organize 6 hours of their day, 180 days a year, it's extraordinarily difficult. So it's understandable why so many teachers, use scripted curricula, because either they have to, they're required, or like truly they're just trying to make sure the day stays on rails. If you don't like believe in the work that you're requiring students to do, like it's not surprising that you have kids that don't want to do the work, right? Or trying to get through it as quickly as possible, or using AI to get it done because like, well, it's like not worth their effort and time. So for me as an educator, and this is just because this is the way that I'm built, like I felt like I had to design everything I gave the kids for the most part, because if I put that time and energy into it and thought into it, then I could at least vouch for the usefulness of it. Now, that's not sustainable, and some of the stuff I think was just bad, but I think that's that kind of idea that like, well, do we really believe in the way that we're spending like these childhoods? And I think increasingly the answer for schools is like, well, no, we're not in these certain ways. And I hope that we can move the roles of teachers like, well, these are things we do believe in, which is like community building. We believe in challenge. We believe in like kids being able to build things, or to have that sort of, to make course corrections when things like don't go the right way. And there's a really important adult figure that can help them along the path. I think that that's where we need to go. And I think everyone feels that. I think a lot of teachers would love to spend more time on that. But there's that, pesky end of year assessment that, a lot of things are based on, including sometimes school funding. So of course, that's where time is devoted.
Hi there. Thank you so much for listening. If you're enjoying What's Next and find value in these conversations, I'd really appreciate it if you could take a moment to subscribe or follow the podcast. It's the best way to make sure you never miss an episode, and it helps us bring more incredible insights to you. Your support truly means the world to me. Thank you for being part of this journey. You mentioned AI. What do you think is the most important technology reshaping education for the future? Is it AI? Is it a mixture of different technologies? And how will this technology reshape education in the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, I don't know that it's this current version of AI is going to be the one that's going to be like the best, teachers or tutors. I think there's certainly some limits at which we've seen, and we'll see. I mean, I have no idea, just like I don't think anyone else does really. I think the greatest opportunity is that students, maybe more than ever, who can play the game can like just play, right? They can compete, they can be in the world, they can like actually like make money doing it, they can find employment. Not that they should be finding jobs at 14, but students that write great code. I mean, again, but this is all in flux, right? I mean, there are people that think that there will be no human written code in 5 years. Which, okay. So I guess it gets to the question of like what actually matters. And so I don't know. So for me, it's a tough question with technology because when I think about the experience at SpaceX, it was like, well, what makes SpaceX work? Like, why is SpaceX one of the most innovative companies in the world? I mean, I think one is that there's a clear mission. The mission is to make humans a multiplanetary species, and then in addition to having a clear mission, you have the question that goes along with that mission, which is, does this help us get to Mars sooner? So depending on wherever you are at the company, you have that question you can ask yourself is like, do I think this is going to get us to Mars sooner, or is it going to take us longer? It doesn't work in all questions always, but it's like kind of helpful that everyone is kind of rowing that same direction. And you have this like incredible amount of talent there as well, because everyone's aligned for that same mission and they're doing the cutting edge work, but also they have the flexibility to try new things and all the rest. Like you just see that they're able to move faster than nearly anybody else. Now, what's interesting for kids, like thinking about like what would it take for kids one day to work at a company like SpaceX or to create a competitor to SpaceX? It's not clear to me that they're going to want to do too much in the traditional vein of education. So even if you have like, AI, I guess that's what's interesting. It's like when you have a true AI tutor, then you're starting to get some of that feedback and starting to get some of those experiences with support that are maybe outside of the traditional path, which is in a lot of ways like academia based, it feels like. So I don't know that AI will, it seems strange to say that AI would not be the chief technology here. I think that just technology in general, that it's like at the fingertips of students, and a lot of it is like free or easy to use. And it's moving so quickly that if you can kind of get on that wave and just ride it, then they just have this huge advantage where things are getting outdated so quickly that if you can find a way onto the wave and then kind of grow with it, I think that that's going to be hugely powerful for these kids. Because for now, I feel like a lot of the remarkable things that are happening outside of school. When you hear about like some of these projects that kids are working on at a young age, it's like, well, yeah, I go to school, but then outside of school, I'm building this rocket in my garage, or I'm joining this robotics team, or I'm writing this poetry. And so I think that that's maybe the possibility. It's not so much a technology as much as like this reallocation of time to create richer childhoods, but also to align time with things that are most attuned to what kids like want to bring to life.
Yeah. The government plays a huge role in education around the world. If you had one wish to government in the area of education, what would it be?
I just wish it wasn't a second-class citizen in terms of priorities. I just don't really think that too many countries take it seriously. I think they say they take it seriously, but I don't think they really do. And frankly, I don't think that many of them, if you gave them $1 trillion to create the best educational system in the world, that they would be able to. Because I don't think they actually know like what it looks like. And I don't think that they've done the real thinking from basics, like what matters, what will likely matter, what are going to be fruitful things to spend time on, and how would we organize it. I'm not saying it's an easy problem. It's not. But I don't think that it's not money, of course, can be helpful, but only if you know what direction to go. And I'm not convinced that they do. And so part of that is taking it far more seriously and looking outside of like the most sort of standard measures of whether a school system is successful or not.
To me as a teacher, one of the most critical things I want my students to take away from class is critical thinking. In your mind, what's the best way for students to learn this?
You need experience making consequential decisions. So for me, there are amazing programs that happen at older ages where students are doing, internships or externships or apprenticeships and things like that. Those are amazing. So, but I've tended to work with more like elementary and middle school students, and there's a way I think to approach this, which I'll get to in a second. But I think just broadly, they need to be making decisions that matter. If you think about a classroom experience, I always remember this in a math class in particular. You raise your hand, oh, you're right, or like, nope, no, that's not it, or all right, well, you're close, you're on the right track. Like those are kind of the three outcomes by and large, right? And a lot of kids, especially in math, just start to disengage because they get a couple wrong publicly, or they just feel like they're not good at it. And it's usually just arithmetic. Like it's not, they're not even really getting into math, and they turn off entirely. And so I think that if you think about like what is the caliber of decisions that a child makes in a typical school day, or even just like what are the decisions, period, that a child gets to make in the course of a school day, I think there aren't many. And I don't think the ones they do make are of like a high quality or have any kind of openness. So what I think is like most critically important, and Conundrums are just a small part of this, is like giving children the opportunity to make decisions in school. And they can be case studies, they can be all kinds of different ways to do it. And then, giving them like feedback on the decisions or having kind of an outcome based on the decision, and then just like making those course corrections, right? Like learning from those, decisions. And then ideally you move this into teamwork, right? Because the teamwork when I was in school was like, all right, we're doing a poster project. The one person who cares about their grade the most will end up doing all of it. The rest will just like hang out, basically. But if you really reconceive of teamwork as more like how SpaceX works or Tesla or any, kind of like really high functioning company, that's like what you want to give them experience of at an early age, and give them like the taste of what it like looks like to contribute value to a high functioning team and to feel like they can do it. They can be part of it. And even if that value they add is small, that they can start to see how other people are trying to add values in a big way, And so part of that too is not allowing the loudest person in a group to sort of just decide what happens. So anyway, that's important. It's just like more like discourse within teams, more discourse as a class, just more like talking, trying to figure things out. That's a huge piece of it. And then the other one is before kids are probably really eligible to internships or apprenticeships or things like that, they can start thinking broadly about some of the challenges that different, companies or governments face and start thinking about potential solutions, right? Like, so if you're going to think about, let's say, government allocation for funds, here's the government of Estonia, here's like where they spend money, like here's between like, I don't know, defense and health and human services and education and all the rest. Like, how would you reallocate this money, based on some studies of Estonia, based on what you can gather? Do some real thinking, and then potentially we could make a connection with someone in the government of Estonia who can maybe share a little bit about some of the decisions that are being made about the budgetary talks and like why things are that way or what it would take for things to change. So giving kids like a taste of real problems in the world now, which as like educators we can bring some of those problems in, simplify them a bit. But there are some of these like mainstream. I mean, the question of how we should spend money as a government is, it's universal. It's timeless, and you don't have to have an extraordinary understanding of Estonia, or it doesn't matter whatever country it is, to start to like kind of weigh in. I was like, well, maybe we could do this or maybe that thing, and like that's fine. And then people will disagree, and like that's where a great conversation can be had. What should the priority be of any given country given the future? And I think that bringing that stuff in makes school feel relevant, timely. It's on the cutting edge. And I think it's just a very, very different experience than having students, reading comprehension passages and answering questions on them based on like, what's the main idea? It's not that kids don't need to learn to read. They absolutely do. But I think increasingly we need to look for ways to like really turn kids to like light these bulbs across their brains, and other things open up, right? It's like success begets success. And I think we've had a little bit of a, let's wait for this thing to happen, and then if this thing happens, then maybe we'll get to this thing. And it's just kind of this line of contingencies, whereas let's just try to do the things that are going to be like most magical, because suddenly all these other things start to come online when you're engaged. And I think if we don't get the engagement piece right, then it's going to be a tough slog no matter what you do.
Absolutely. And what should students learn today to be ready for 2035 or even 2045?
I think you have to just know your value, find your voice, and figure out how you can contribute in any type of team. Those are not easy things to do, and school is not necessarily designed to help you do those things very well. But I think we have to lean into what makes us most human and do those things as much as we can. And I think those are the things like this, the collaborative nature of humanity is what makes us most unique. And if we're not spending time in those things, and it's just sort of like the rote learning or whatever else, I just don't think that that's going to have as much value going forward.
So, and how do you personally keep a sense of wonder alive?
I just have to keep creating, and that could be like just creating new games or designing just like a new facet of the school, or it just like always just trying to create something new, like learning the lessons of what you've created in the past. And then of course, almost inevitably by the end, despising the thing that you created and wishing it could have been so much better. So for the class I teach at Astronova, we will usually read like a short story. Because I feel like in some ways, coming to terms with the technology, it's actually through the lens of short stories, through fiction is actually in a lot of ways better than anything else I've found. So we'll read like a Vonnegut or a Bradbury or a Ursula Le Guin sort of like short story, and then I'll design, and then we'll like talk about sort of the resonance of this short story in the world. So for example, like quantum computing. So we'll read like Epic Hack by Kurt Vonnegut, we'll talk about quantum computing and implications and all the rest, and then I'll design a game that is sort of inspired by like quantum computing. So there's like qubits and there's whatever. But that's the idea, is that we're kind of engaged in these different levels and we'll play a game that inevitably at the end of the game, which I'll just make for that one class for that one time, I myself will have learned a lot of lessons of like, wow, I should have done this differently, or I'll do this again. And as much as I would love to like play it again the next term, like I just force myself to design something new, because rather than making tweaks to the original game, I'd rather learn the lessons of that game and then apply them to some future thing I'll create in a different field. So that's the way that I keep things fresh and challenging and sometimes confounding.
Brilliant. So you've spent years creating and shaping how young people learn. How has that influenced the way you learn and you think about the world?
I like to read things that are like at the edge of my comprehension. And so I think that that's been a huge piece. And so part of it early on at the school was that because we didn't have an English teacher, I was teaching English. So it's a good question. Like, what ought one to read with 11 and 12-year-olds? So we ended up reading in one school year the Iliad, Odyssey, and Aeneid, which I'd never read in school, which again, one of those things, like things that you can share with kids that are then will shape the rest of their lives. And what an amazing experience to have that at a young age. And I was not reading that until I was, my late 20s. But then also just that, so that has continued for me is like will pick up, like, I'll read like the Odyssey, or not the Odyssey, the Ulysses, or, just a bunch of like really like the Robert Caro biographies of LBJ or something like that. Like really try to challenge myself to read something that is like really dense that can maybe change the way that I like see the world. And spending a lot of time, just reading. I think sometimes it's easy to get sucked into the news or reading articles and all the rest. And I definitely have done that for large swaths of my life. But I think now, and what I like want for the kids is like to be able to have like an internal world that is not, when it's just you and a book. Ideally, like those are the two pieces. But when you're just bouncing between articles or podcasts, you're listening at 2x speed, and it's just sometimes there's a use for that, but that can't be like the major way that you sort of engage. I think there's a real value in spending time to think and to like read something that has real value, ideally timeless value, and thinking of its implications for you and your life and for the wider world. So that's maybe the greatest influence for me is like seeing the kids when they dive into like really challenging stuff, how much they talk about how it changes them. And I feel the same way.
What's the thing at the edge of your knowledge that you're currently looking into?
That's a great question. Well, I'm still trying to understand. I read just recently The Making of the Atomic Bomb, which I still, in terms of organization, collaboration, and secrecy, and the implications of the technology and all the rest, I think that certainly like, the physics of it is beyond my comprehension, not at the edge. But just even the way that governments have been able to get, and people have been able to get things done. And I think that is a really important thing right now in this time is like, do we have like the will to get things done? Have we lost our abilities to get things done? What is in the way and how much of these things are human created versus actual limitations of physics? So that to me is like something I spend a lot of time just like thinking about. And as it relates to education, I mean, as I said, sometimes it's just that we don't have the right ideas. Not that I have the right ideas, but I don't know that we've like really figured out the right ideas of like and have the conviction to say this is what schools should look like and feel like. And I think once we get that, then there's an opportunity to leverage some of the money and some of the energy to kind of like make this thing work. Because there are a lot of people that are doing innovative work in education, but it's just not scalable. You really can't get together 25 kids and have them pay $20,000 a year and say that this is like a groundbreaking model, So anyway, I think there's got to be a lot more humility with those that are fortunate enough to work in a way they have like a lot of freedom and independence. But I think we got to think about the child who is not given an opportunity maybe to have access to those pieces and figure out how how their day to day can change, basically.
Josh, we like to end the show on a positive note, so we ask all guests the same question, which is, what makes you optimistic about the future?
Oh, I have a 2-year-old, a 4-year-old, and a 6-year-old. So yeah, I'm exposed to the wonder that they get to see, like sharing the world with them, and them sharing the world with me is like the most amazing, beautiful thing I couldn't have imagined before being a parent. I'm really optimistic because the students that I've had at Astronova and in Synthesis are remarkable. Kids from all over the world who come together to work with strangers. Every day in Synthesis, they get sorted into a team of kids they don't know. And those people, total strangers, different from all over, find a way, like find common ground and find like good rapport and find a way to like make tough decisions together and like make course corrections and ultimately like find success. And they do that, every week. So that to me just gives me a huge amount of optimism for the future because I've seen it when we put together, college students in the same environment and they freeze, they get self-aware, they don't want to participate or they can't participate or they and it's just so amazing to see kids who can just throw themselves into problems and figure things out. So I've only seen things moving in one direction, which is the students are more capable, they're more curious, they're more adaptable, and frankly, like they're the type of people that you would want to one day work for or work with because they're powerhouses. So that's what I'm optimistic about is like these kids actually coming of age. We want a more capable generation than our generations, right? We want to give them everything. And so I think it's really important that we give them all those tools because I believe in them. maybe more so than us. So I'll end it on that, I guess.
Wonderful. Josh, thank you so much for your insights and for sharing so many wonderful and amazing things about the future of education and what's next in education with us. And to our listeners, stay curious and join us next time for more insights on what's next.